Hello. This is going to be a two-part series of lectures on Chapter 5, the neurosensory system, the neurosensory organization it's called. And I have divided it into two and put 5 quiz questions at the end of each segment. So at the end of this segment, there will be 5 quiz questions. And I'll leave those to you to try to solve, and which I think you can, and but we'll go over them when we're in class, just so you know how we're going to approach the subject. Let me share my screen, and this will be Chapter 5, as I said. Here we go. Let me make it big. Oh, here we go. All right. Neurosensory organization, Chapter 5. We are going to be looking at 2 basic systems. One for subserving pain and temperature sensation, and that has one anatomy, and the other one for subserving fine touch and proprioception, and that has a separate, but part of the system completely overlaps. So we'll see how that works. But we're going to start with basically with pain and temperature. But this particular slide sort of overviews it. We're going to look at the dorsal column system for fine touch, fine tactile or touch sensation, proprioception, and also kinesthesia. I didn't mention that one, but that's in the same system. We're also going to be looking at the lateral spinal thalamic tract for pain and temperature sensations. Now, both of these things are in the spinal cord, so those terms should sound familiar to you at this point, especially the dorsal column system, because we looked at the sort of the gross orientation and organization of the spinal cord earlier. We are going to take a quick look at the medial or anterior spinal thalamic tract for crude touch sensation, but we're not going to pay much attention to that. I mean, it's in the figures, you'll see it, but we're not going to try to analyze it, because we can do all the problem solving we need to and completely understand the pattern of signs and symptoms that our patients have by looking at the fine touch and proprioceptive and kinesthesia system and the lateral spinal thalamic tract for pain and temperature. These pathways continue their ascent within the brainstem. After they get above the spinal cord, they continue in the brainstem. So we'll trace them all the way up to the post-central gyrus. But you'll note when we get to the brainstem that the names of the pathways change a little bit. So we'll look at that. All right. So looking first at the spinal thalamic pathways for pain and temperature sensations. This is an illustration from your book. It's figure 5.5. And what they are showing basically is highly schematized. In other words, it doesn't look like the real anatomy, but it reflects the real anatomy and traces the pathway basically from a receptor up to the sensory cortex. I don't know how much you know about receptors. There's a little bit of it in the book, but there are different types of receptors for different types of sensation. Sometimes for some, like a pressure on the skin, or if you touch lightly in a way that disturbs the hairs, there's some little receptors that wrap around the base of hairs. And so this gives these different receptors, depending how they get stimulated, gives our experiences different qualities. So there is a receptor, and for pain and temperature, often the receptor is simply what's called a free nerve ending. It's like a dendrite. It doesn't have any specialized characteristics to it. It's simply a dendrite. And what happens is if it gets damaged at all, it initiates action potentials, which we perceive as pain. So that's one type of receptor and a very common one. At any rate, there's something that will initiate an action potential when it gets stimulated, and that's what we're calling a receptor. And then there is a first order neuron that courses back toward the central nervous system through a first through a dorsal root, first through the spinal nerve, and then through a dorsal root. As you remember, all afferent neurons enter the spinal cord through a dorsal root. And at that point, there is a synapse of the second order neuron in the dorsal horn. So these are, again, these are neurons that are carrying pain and temperature sensations, and they're going to enter the cord and synapse in the dorsal horn. The second order neuron then crosses the midline, and that is what is being shown here. They're showing this. Here's the sensory axon, a dorsal root, a dorsal column. It just kind of gets into the dorsal column, although nothing really happens there. It may go up like just a little bit or down just a little bit, and then it forms its synapse in the dorsal horn. And that's why this says second order neuron. Because you have one neuron that gets from the receptor back inside the cord around the dorsal horn, and then you have a second order neuron, and then that one crosses the midline. So that is, let's see, here's the point, crosses the midline and organizes itself into this thing. We're going to pay attention to this, the lateral spinal thalamic tract. Now we'll look at a cross section of the cord, which is more anatomically realistic in just a moment, and you'll see where that exactly is located. But the important part for this particular figure is simply to show you that that second order neuron crossed the midline, and then it continues on up. And it continues into the brainstem. Once it gets into the brainstem, about halfway up the medulla, it gets a different name. It's then at that point called the medial lemniscus. And we will look at the medial lemniscus again when we look at fine touch and proprioception. The pathway in the cord is different from what we're talking about now for fine touch and proprioception. But when you get up to the mid-level of the medulla, the two pathways for fine touch and proprioception and for pain and temperature, they come together and they form a medial lemniscus. And that medial lemniscus just continues on its pathway up to higher in the brain until it gets to the thalamus, and there it synapses. So now that would be the third order neuron. The third order neuron travels through something that I've mentioned before, but we haven't looked at it in great detail, certainly. It travels through the internal capsule. This is not labeled here, but here's the thalamus, and you see the black arrow here. Where is that going through? The internal capsule. It's going through the internal capsule and getting up to the postcentral gyrus. Here they just label it the sensory cortex, but that's what we're talking about. Okay, so that is this pathway. Where do the neurons cross? Basically, they cross very close to the level where they come in. The ones from your lower extremities cross, second order neurons cross low in the spinal cord. The ones that are from up around here, in the upper part of the body, no, I'm not talking about the head yet, but just the upper part of the body, those second order neurons cross high in the cord. Either which way, they get the information up to the lateral spinal thalamic tract, and it continues up into the medulla. All right, I just wanted to mention this crude touch pathway because it's here. They show that some of the neurons across and go up in a differently named tract that is more anterior in the cord. We'll look at it, but we're not going to interpret it, and that is the anterior or ventral spinal thalamic tract. It's involved in the perception of crude touch. But for our purposes of understanding the major patterns of sensory loss in patients that we will see, we can forget about that, and that's just what I'm going to do. I'm mentioning it's in your book, but that's kind of it for us. All right, now, this is a cross section. It's more anatomically realistic, and it allows us to get a look at the lateral spinal thalamic tract. And I'll just point out where the anterior one is. Here's the anterior, well, let's see, where is it? Anterior spinal thalamic tract right here, it's blue. And then that's the one we're ignoring. And then here is the lateral spinal thalamic tract. And I want to point out something very important. You note that it's somatotopically organized. I've used that word a number of times, and I've mentioned a lot of your system is somatotopically organized, including the postcentral gyrus. Remember the sensory homunculus? That's a somatotopic organization. If you go down and you look at the organization of the internal capsule, That's somatotopically organized. In other words, information that is coming from the upper part of the body is on one end of that internal capsule. Information that's coming from the lower end of the body is at the other end of the internal capsule, and then there's everything in between. So this shows you there are neurons that originated from the sacral level, the lumbar level, the thoracic level, and the cervical level. The fact that they put that cervical here in this particular figure tells us that this is a horizontal section through a spinal cord high in the cord. High in the cord. How do I know that? Well, because it's got cervical level fibers in it. If you do a section down below the lateral spinal thalamic tract, let's say go way down into the lumbar area, the lateral spinal thalamic tract, first of all, is literally smaller. It doesn't have as many second order neurons in it. As you look at higher and higher level, more and more second order neurons for pain and temperature are being added to that system, and literally it looks bigger. And the whole cord gets bigger for that matter. It's bigger in its diameter. But there's the somatotopic organization, and let me see if we've covered everything here. I pointed out where the anterior spinal thalamic tract is, but we're not going to do anything in terms of interpreting. And I think I've covered everything on this slide. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, now this is a fairly anatomically realistic illustration, which shows the central nervous system and part of the peripheral nervous system, because here we have a spinal nerve and a dorsal root, a ventral root. That's PNS, not CNS. But what they have done is they have done a horizontal section through some level of the spinal cord, here it is, through some level of the medulla, here it's labeled, through some level of the pons, you're going higher and higher, the midbrain, and finally up in the cerebrum. The section is not horizontal any longer because that wouldn't show what we're trying to look at very well. It's coronal. And they show that the thalamus, here's the thalamus, and the postcentral gyrus. All right, so we are going to consider, I'm going to point, first of all, let me point out something, but we're going to consider what happens to pain and temperature sensation with lesions at different levels of the CNS and the PNS too. We'll consider that as well. So let us do that. And I want to point out that they do have part of the dorsal column system for the sensation of fine touch, proprioception, and kinesthesia. It's in here, and we will look at this illustration again when we get to fine touch, proprioception, and kinesthesia. But right now we're just looking at the pain pathway. So I want to just point out what we just looked at very schematically as far as pain is concerned. Here are first order afferent neurons carrying pain and temperature sensation back through a spinal nerve, a dorsal root, and here synapsing in, what's that called? The dorsal horn. The dorsal horn. Second order neurons are crossing the midline and organizing themselves into a lateral spinal thalamic tract and a medial spinal thalamic tract. Let's forget the medial. Let's just follow this lateral. It goes up and is labeled the lateral spinal thalamic tract. It gets into the medulla, and here the lateral and the medial come together into one tract, and it's simply called the spinal thalamic tract. The spinal thalamic tract continues up and is named as such until about the mid-medulla. And what happens in the mid-medulla is that the neurons that are carrying information for fine touch and proprioception, they're coming up in the dorsal column. We'll look at it. They synapse here in these two nuclei. We'll look at those. And then those second order neurons cross and join with the neurons that are in the spinal thalamic tract. And that's where you label it then the medial lemniscus. Okay, so here it is. It's labeled the medial lemniscus all the way from the mid-medulla up. So here's a section through the pons, and there it is. Here's a section through the midbrain, excuse me for jumping like that. And here is the thalamus. Note that they have labeled it here, not just the thalamus, but the ventral postural lateral nucleus of the thalamus. There is a ventral postural medial nucleus of the thalamus. That's a little more detail than we need. So I'm just pointing out that that is the thalamus we've been talking about, where the synapse occurs. And then you get the third order neurons ascending up through the internal capsule to the postcentral gyrus. All right. The reason we don't need this level of detail is that we're never going to differentiate between patients who have lesions in different parts of the thalamus. You're going to see a lot of patients who have lesions in the thalamus, but we're not going to differentiate a lesion of one nucleus of the thalamus from another one. All right. So that is the organization of this. It's a very useful one to spend a little time with and study it, because it this one thing pretty much shows everything we're talking about when we're talking about sensation for the body. And the reason I'm starting with the body and not the head is because the head is more complex. The head, all the afferent neurons for sensation in the head plug into this system. So we're going to be plugging it in just like you plug a lamp into the wall. But you have to first understand this system. Otherwise, the plugins don't quite make any sense. All right. So now that you're oriented to the figure, we're going to go back and consider the effects of lesions in different regions, different parts of this pathway that we're looking at. So my first example is, what do you think would happen with a spinal nerve on the right at T6 that has a lesion? What would you lose? You're going to go back and look at the dermatome chart. It's on page 47. I have a little note at the bottom of this slide. And you can see where the T6 dermatome is located. It's about in the middle of the body, basically. I'm not going to bother looking at that right now, but take the time to go look at that. You can see exactly where it's located. And you can see how precisely the neurologist, by analyzing the loss of sensation, can identify that there's this one dermatome, the T6 dermatome on the right, that doesn't transmit any sensation. In other words, they can take a little piece of cotton or something and touch the patient with their eyes closed so they don't see it, and ask them to describe when they feel it. And they can do that all over, and they feel everything except not in the right T6 dermatome. Okay, so it's pretty precise diagnostics. They know at that point that it's the T6 spinal nerve, or it could be the dorsal root. Now, if you only test sensation, the T6 spinal nerve lesion and the T6 dorsal root lesion look exactly the same. In order to differentiate between the two, you have to also test motor. Well, we haven't gotten to motor yet, but we will. But as far as just considering sensation, you would not discern the difference between a T6 spinal nerve lesion and a T6 dorsal root lesion by simply testing only sensation. Okay, now let's move the lesion inside the cord. And the lesion in this third example is on the right side of the cord at T6. Only the right side, it only goes up. So we considered that before, where you might have a herniated disc, or you could have a tumor, or you could have some kind of mechanical injury from a fracture or a gunshot wound or a knife wound that only, in effect, functionally transects the cord on the right only at the level of T6. And in that case, now I'm going to ask you to consider pain and temperature, because that's what we're talking about. You would lose pain and temperature sensation at every level below T6 in all those dermatomes, T7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, the lumbar, the sacral, all of it. You'd lose it. In other words, they won't feel painful stimulation in that quadrant of the body. Now, which quadrant? The damage is on the right. The loss would be on the left. Why? Let's consider why. Because all those second order neurons in this pathway we're talking about crossed at the level they entered. At all those lower levels, they crossed and they ascended then in the right The pathway originated on the left, they crossed and they ascend in the right lateral spinal thalamic tract, and they get interrupted at T6. So hopefully that makes sense. Work with it until it does, because it's just really key to understanding the relationship between area of damage, or what I'm calling lesions, and the areas of functional losses, or signs and symptoms. All right, now let's consider this next, the fourth one. The damage is in the right side of the medulla, and it's not just anywhere in the medulla, it's in the upper medulla. That means it's above this decussation. It's above this decussation, but for the purpose of considering just pain and temperature, we don't have to worry about that. When we get fine touch and proprioception, you'll see the implications. But for right now, let's consider the loss. There will be a loss of pain and temperature sensation over 1/2 of the body. Forget about the head for now, but 1/2 of the whole body. And what side is it going to be on? The damage is on the right. The loss will be on the left side of the body. Why? Because all of those second order neurons in this pathway for the entire body, not the head, crossed at the level of their entrance. And now they're being interrupted at the upper medulla on the right. Okay? The same thing would hold for a damage in the right thalamus. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference if you only tested pain and temperature and you only tested the body, not the head. That it would be exactly the same. In other words, you couldn't quite tell exactly where that level of damage is in the system. But you'd know it's above the cord because it's the whole body, and you'd know it's on the right side because the loss of pain and temperature is on the left. Okay, and then let's say it's the final one. It's damage in the area of the right postcentral gyrus in the facial region. Pain and temperature, we're just talking about that. There will be a loss of pain and temperature sensation in the facial region. I guess we are thinking about the head this time, in the facial region on the opposite side, because we're above the decussation. The damage is above the decussation. Okay. We probably will want to discuss that and use more examples in class, but that is for right now. Now we're going to move on to the pathway for fine touch proprioception and kinesthesia. And that is often called the dorsal column system within the spinal cord, because all of the neurons carrying this type of information are in the dorsal columns. Let me go back to a slide right here and remind you where the dorsal column is. We studied that before. It's here. The dorsal column happens to contain these fasciculi or tracts. They're also called tracts. It's really the same thing. The fasciculus cuneatus and the fasciculus gracilis. We'll look at that in detail, but I'm just orienting you to where the dorsal column is. And all the neurons in the dorsal column system are carrying fine touch and proprioceptive and kinesthetic information. It's kind of the simplest column there in the cord. There's a lateral column and there's a ventral column, but the dorsal column is just the gross area of white matter in this region, sort of sandwiched in between the two dorsal horns. That's the dorsal column system. So when you hear the term dorsal column system, you know it's the system that's mediating fine touch and proprioception and kinesthesia for the body. All right, there we go. Okay, now, so again, we're going to kind of follow the same pattern here. We're going to consider that there are receptors. There's a receptor out in the body. It could be just under the skin. It could be in the muscle, because your muscles can perceive, pressure and when they're being stretched and so forth. You've got them in your joints. You've got various kinds of receptors for coding, basically, different dimensions of fine touch, proprioception, and kinesthesia. And they all attach to a neuron, which would be the first order neuron. And that neuron travels back through some branches and ultimately gets into one spinal nerve, carrying information from one dermatome. And it enters through the dorsal, through the dorsal root. Yeah, through the dorsal root. and then it gets itself into the dorsal column system. Now, let us look for a moment back at, I'm going forward to this slide. This is the dorsal column system, and it has two tracts in it. The one that is more medial is what they call the gracile fasciculus. I've been calling it the fasciculus gracilis. It could also be called the gracile tract. So it's got to have that word gracile or gracilis in it. And that is carrying fine touch and proprioception information from the lower extremity. Then fasciculus cuneatus carrying the same type of information, but from the upper part of the body. If we did a section low in the cord, there is no fasciculus cuneatus. There's only a smaller fasciculus gracilis, because so far only neurons carrying fine touch proprioceptive information from the lower part of the body are there. The ones for the upper part of the body will join the system and make a bigger dorsal column up higher and higher. So as you look at different successively higher and higher levels, the dorsal column system gets bigger, and the biggest dorsal column system would be in C1 as high. Okay, so let's see. So here we have peripheral nerves from the leg and lower body organizing themselves into a fasciculus gracilis. Here they call it the medial dorsal column. Okay, it's the one that's going to be most toward the center. And then at higher levels, you get peripheral nerves coming from the arm and the upper body organizing themselves into the fasciculus cuneatus or dorsal column. Now, one important thing to really note here in this very schematic depiction of this system is that these first order neurons that are traveling up in the cord have not synapsed any place, and they have not crossed the midline. And they ascend up into the medulla. Here it is. And at this point, they finally synapse. The ones from the lower part of the body synapse in a nucleus, which is thankfully the name kind of tells you, it's the nucleus gracilis. And the ones from the upper part of the body synapse in the nucleus cuneatus. So at that point now, they're synapsing on the second order neurons. The second order neuronal cell bodies actually make up those nuclei. That's what the nuclei are. They're cell bodies, dendrites, and connections in this pathway. The second order neuron now crosses the midline. Here it is, crossing the midline. And we're at what level are we? The mid-medulla. So they continue, the two fasciculi continue their ascent up through the cord and into the lower medulla, synapse on the on these two nuclei, the second order neurons cross the midline, and then they join the fine touch and proprioceptive pathway. Remember, now we called that one at that point, because they'd all kind of come together, simply the spinal thalamic tract. And at that point, the mid-medulla, you get the spinal thalamic tract and the dorsal column system coming together into a single structure called the medial lemniscus. And that medial lemniscus continues on up through the pons in the midbrain, and finally synapses in the VPL. I'll put that little kind of in parentheses because you don't need to learn that detail. It synapses in the thalamus. And then the third order neurons travel up through the internal capsule in a somatotopically organized way to the post-central gyrus. Okay, so I think we've got all of this stuff here. We've gone through it all. And you understand this schematic illustration. And then we're going to look at something that's a little more anatomically realistic. But this shows us this important 3-neuron chain or 3-neuron pathway, and it shows us where the crossing is. Let's see, is there anything else to look at here? I don't think so. I think we're ready to go on. So let's go on to this one. And again, you can see the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus located in the dorsal column. So there's nothing really new here. We've kind of covered that. here. Now here, what we're going to do here is we're going to combine our two systems. So we have the spinal thalamic tract coming up here as the lateral spinal thalamic tract, and the medial gets up here to the medulla, and it combines, those two things combine into a spinal thalamic tract. And here it is, here it's labeled. And then you can see at the mid medulla, the second order neurons for the fine touch and proprioceptive system cross and join the spinal thalamic tract to form a medial lemniscus. So that is what we're seeing here. It's just the same thing as the schematic you just saw. It brought the two systems together. It shows where they come together, mid medulla, and it shows you by the time you get above the mid medulla, the pathway is carrying all of those sensory information from the opposite side of the body. So if you put a lesion up here, well, we'll look at that in a moment, but let me just jump ahead. If you put a lesion way up here, you're going to lose fine touch, proprioception, kinesthesia, pain, and temperature, all from the opposite side of the body. Okay, and here we have. So now we're going to look at fine touch and proprioception. I think I put all the damage at the same level. And let me see if I have one more slide in which we bring it all together. Yeah, I do. Okay, so here just fine touch and proprioception. Consider a lesion of the right T6 spinal nerve. Again, you get out your dermatome chart, page 47, and you're going to see that you would lose fine touch and proprioception in the dermatome, T6 dermatome on the right. I mean, the proprioception, since it involves other things like movement and so forth and position, not as easy to test and not as self-evident as simply testing fine touch, but it's very easy to demonstrate the loss of fine touch sensation in a particular dermatome. Okay, and again, just as we talked about for pain and temperature, if you move the damage to the T6 dorsal root, there will be a loss of fine touch proprioception, or just call it fine touch at this point because we're talking about light touch, in the T6 dermatome on the right. Now, put the damage into the cord on the T6 level, at the T6 level, and it's the right side of the cord. The loss of fine touch and proprioception, where's that going to be? It is going to be on the right side of the body, different from pain and temperature. It's on the right side of the body because when you're considering the pathway, the neurons, which would be still first order neurons, have not crossed the midpoint, have not crossed the midline at that point. They're going to cross where? Mid medulla. So the loss will be on the right side below the level of the lips of the lesion. So it would be T7, 8, 9, 10, the lumbar, all on the right. Now let's put the damage in the right upper medulla. That is above the decussation of both of the systems we've talked about. So the loss of sensation, all of them, fine touch, proprioception, pain, and temperature sensation, would be on the opposite side of the body, left, and would be the whole body, not considering the face yet. Now, right thalamus, same thing, loss on the left side. A right postcentral gyrus in the facial region, it would be a loss of all the sensations we have talked about on the left side in the facial region. All right, now we can talk about, well, they sort of did this now, because I think I've thrown in fine touch, proprioception, pain, and temperature on all of them. So you know, I'm sure you know now what the loss of all of those sensations would be with damage of T6 on the right, the spinal nerve, the dorsal root. They would be the same. You wouldn't be able to discern the difference between a right T6 spinal nerve and a right T6 dorsal root by just testing sensation. You'd have to test motor, and then you can see the difference. Now, let's consider this one, because this is kind of interesting, and it shows you how easy hemichord damage is to identify in a patient who has it. We're looking at the third example. The damage is on the right side of the spinal cord at the level of T6. Now let's consider fine touch and proprioception first. The loss would be on the left for all the dermatomes. Oh, excuse me, that's not right. The loss would be on the right for all the dermatomes below T6. How do I know it's on the right? Because that pathway doesn't cross until higher. Now, pain and temperature. The loss would be on the left. You see what an interesting pattern it is? You lose pain and temperature sensation for all dermatomes below T6 on the left side, but fine touch and proprioception on the right side. All right, now let's bring it up to the right side of the upper medulla. The losses of all of those things will be on the left now because the upper medulla is above the crossing of both of the systems we're talking about. Same thing for the right thalamus. It will be on, the losses will be on the left. Same thing for the right postcentral gyrus. It will be on the left, but it will just be in the facial region because that's the damage is limited to that. Okay, now here are your 5 questions. So go through them and work them out, and then we will cover that next time when we join each other in class itself. All right, we'll see you.